It was a little past midnight. I had just finished a late shift at the diner where I worked, exhaustion settling deep in my bones. The streets were unnervingly quiet, the distant hum of traffic on the highway the only sign of life. A few flickering neon signs from 24-hour shops cast a weak, bluish glow on the wet pavement. The faint scent of fried food and gasoline lingered in the air. Remnants of a busy evening now faded into the silence of night. The bus stop sat at the corner of an empty intersection, framed by an old newspaper vending machine covered in peeling stickers and graffiti. A single streetlight overhead flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows across the cracked sidewalk. The posted schedule, weathered and curling at the edges, showed my bus wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes. I sighed, shifting my bag on my shoulder and pulling my coat tighter. The cold had a way of settling into your skin, making every minute of waiting stretch unbearably long. I wasn't alone. A man sat on the far end of the bench, his face obscured by the deep hood of his jacket. His posture was unnerving, hunched over, completely motionless, as if frozen in thought. He didn't shift, didn't fidget like most people waiting for a bus. He just sat there, staring at the ground. Something about the unnatural stillness sent a ripple of unease through me. Instinctively, I kept my distance, opting to stand a few feet away rather than sit. I pulled out my phone, pretending to scroll, but my mind remained fixed on the man's presence. I told myself I was being paranoid, and yet, something in my gut told me to stay alert. After a few minutes, I stole a glance at him. Something about the way he sat there, completely still, unsettled me. Most people at bus stops fidget, scrolling through their phones, adjusting their bags, tapping their feet impatiently, or at least shifting their posture. He did none of that. His body remained rigid, hands tucked deep into the front pocket of his hoodie, shoulders slightly hunched. His breath was slow, almost calculated, as if he was waiting for something. Then, as if sensing my gaze, his head turned slightly. Not all the way, just enough to let me know he was aware of me. It wasn't the casual, distracted glance of someone noticing movement in their peripheral vision. It was controlled, deliberate. His face remained hidden in the shadow of his hood, but the way he moved felt unnatural, as though he had been waiting for me to look at him. A strange chill crawled up my spine. I looked away quickly, focusing on my phone screen, even though there was nothing to check. My fingers mindlessly scrolled, but my mind was fixated on the presence sitting at the other end of the bench. The seconds ticked by slowly, each one dragging heavier than the last. The distant sound of a siren wailed somewhere in the city, but here, in this dimly lit pocket of the world, all I could hear was the faint hum of the streetlight above us and the sound of my own breathing, suddenly louder than before. A rustling sound made me glance up. He had shifted, sitting up straighter. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe he was just stretching, maybe he was waiting for the same bus. Then he spoke. "You waiting for the 22?" His voice was low, rough like he hadn't spoken in hours. I nodded, not wanting to engage in conversation. He chuckled under his breath. "Might not come." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away, just stared at me. Then after a moment he said, "Sometimes the schedule's wrong. You could be waiting here a long time." That didn't sit right with me. I checked the posted schedule again. The bus was still 10 minutes away. Footsteps echoed from down the street. I turned, relieved to see someone else approaching. Safety in numbers. It was a tall man, dressed in dark clothing. He walked with purpose, his hands stuffed into his pockets. As he got closer, I expected him to stand near the stop, maybe check his phone. Instead, he stopped a few feet away from me and just stood there, too close to be casual. I glanced at the man on the bench. He was staring at the new arrival, a strange look in his eye. The air felt heavier now. I took a small step back, gripping my bag. The tall man finally spoke. "You got the time?" My stomach twisted. The way he asked, it wasn't normal. It wasn't casual. I hesitated. Yeah, it's 12:17. He didn't check his watch, didn't react at all, just nodded slightly. Then the man on the bench stood up. I stepped back again. My instincts screamed at me. Leave. Now. Before I could make a move, headlights flashed at the end of the street. A bus. My bus. Relief flooded me, but I kept my guard up. The two men hadn't moved. I turned, preparing to step toward the curb, when the bench guy suddenly took a step forward. "Maybe this isn't your ride," he muttered. I froze. The bus rolled closer, its brakes hissing. I made my decision. I bolted for the curb, just as the doors opened. I didn't look back as I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The driver, a middle-aged woman, gave me a curious glance as I fumbled for my pass. "Everything okay?" she asked. I turned my head slightly. The two men were still standing there watching. "Yes," I lied. "I just want to go home." The doors shut and the bus pulled away. Only then did I exhale, my hands still trembling. That was the last time I ever waited alone at that bus stop. I never found out who those men were, or what they wanted. Maybe they were just messing with me. Maybe they had worse intentions. But I knew one thing. I had listened to my gut, and that had saved me. From that night on, I made sure to always wait where it was crowded, where there were cameras, where there was light, and I never ignored that creeping feeling in my gut again. It was around 8 p.m. when I left work. The restaurant had been packed, the dinner rush extending later than usual, and my feet throbbed from standing all day. My uniform smelled faintly of grease and coffee, clinging to me like an unwanted reminder of the long shift. All I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and collapse into bed. The streets were quiet, except for the occasional car passing by, its headlights momentarily illuminating the sidewalk before vanishing into the distance. The night air was crisp, tinged with the scent of damp asphalt and distant exhaust fumes. A few storefronts still had dimly lit signs, flickering neon casting fractured reflections on the pavement. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, feeling the slight chill creep through the fabric. I made my way to the bus stop, nestled between an old bookstore and a coffee shop that had long since closed for the night. The bookstore's display window was filled with dusty paperbacks and yellowing bestsellers from years ago. A handwritten closed sign hung slightly askew on the door, and behind the glass, the faint outline of stacked chairs was visible in the coffee shop, as if frozen in time. The streetlights above buzzed softly, their weak glow casting long shadows that danced across the empty sidewalk. I was alone. The bus stop bench was cold and slightly damp from the evening air, so I opted to stand instead, shifting my weight from one foot to the other. I pulled out my phone, scrolling mindlessly through my messages, pretending to be absorbed in something, anything, to distract myself from the eerie stillness of the street. Then I noticed him. Across the street, near a lamppost, a man stood partially obscured by shadows. He wasn't doing anything. No phone, no cigarette, no clear reason to be lingering at that spot. He was just standing there, facing in my direction, unmoving. His posture was rigid, hands buried deep in his pockets, his face unreadable in the dim light. A slow, unsettling feeling crawled up my spine. I forced myself to look away, convincing myself it was nothing. Just another pedestrian, maybe waiting for a ride. But something about the way he stood there, completely still, made my skin prickle with unease. A man was standing on the other side of the street, partially obscured by the shadows near a lamppost. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, looking in my direction. His posture was stiff, hands buried deep in his pockets, and his stance wide, as if bracing himself against the night breeze. The dim light from the street lamp barely reached him, casting only half his face in a ghostly glow, while the rest remained hidden in darkness. There was something unnatural about how still he was. Most people waiting for someone would glance around, check their phones, shift their weight, but not him. He stood like a statue, unwavering, as if he had no intention of moving, until I did. A cold sensation crawled up my spine. I told myself he was just another person waiting, maybe lost in thought, maybe watching for a friend's car. I turned my focus back to my phone, scrolling aimlessly, pretending to be engrossed in something important, even though I wasn't reading a single word on the screen. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the bus finally rumbled into view, headlights flashing briefly across the pavement. As it slowed to a stop, brakes hissing, I took a step forward. At that exact moment, the man started moving too. Not toward the intersection, not toward any nearby buildings, directly toward me. I took a seat near the middle of the bus, close enough to the driver to feel safe, but far enough back to avoid attention. The bus was mostly empty, just a few scattered passengers, an old woman near the front, a teenager in headphones staring out the window, and a man half asleep in the back. Then the man from the street stepped onto the bus. He paid his fare and crumpled bills, then turned his head, scanning the rows of seats. When his gaze settled on me, something in my stomach twisted. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just walked straight to the seat behind mine and sat down. Too close, way too close. I kept my eyes on my phone, pretending I hadn't noticed, but my mind raced. Was I overreacting? Was this just a coincidence? Then I heard it, a whisper. Too soft to make out words, but I knew he was talking to me. I turned slightly, just enough to see him from the corner of my eye. His face was too blank, too expressionless, like he wasn't really seeing me, just watching, studying. I swallowed hard and made a decision. I had to get off this bus. I pressed the stop request button earlier than usual. I didn't want him following me all the way to my actual stop. The bus slowed, pulling up to a relatively busy intersection. A gas station, a late-night diner, some foot traffic, safety in numbers. I stood up. So did he. My pulse skyrocketed. My hands felt clammy as I forced myself to walk to the exit without running. Running would make me look scared. Running might provoke him. The moment my feet hit the pavement, I moved quickly toward the diner, keeping my eyes straight ahead. The bus pulled away. He was still behind me. I pushed open the diner door and stepped inside, the warm scent of coffee and grease hitting me instantly. A few customers sat in booths, a bored waitress wiping down the counter. I turned my head, expecting to see the man enter, but he hadn't followed me inside. Instead, he stood outside, just beyond the glass, watching. I locked eyes with him, and for the first time, I saw something flicker across his face. Annoyance? Frustration? Then, as suddenly as he had followed me, he turned and walked away. I stayed in the diner for another 20 minutes, making sure he was really gone before calling a friend to pick me up. I never saw him again. Never found out who he was, what he wanted, or why he chose to follow me that night. But I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't random. From that night on, I was more careful. I never wore headphones while waiting for a bus, never let myself get too distracted in public. And I always trusted my gut. Because sometimes being followed isn't just paranoia. Sometimes it's real. The evening air carried a crisp chill, the kind that signaled the arrival of autumn. It was just past 9 p.m. when my friend Jake and I reached the bus stop, our breath faintly visible in the cool night. The streets were mostly silent, the occasional passing car breaking the stillness with the hum of its engine. Overhead, the streetlights cast an amber glow, their flickering bulbs reflecting off the damp pavement. Leaves, brittle and dry, rustled as the wind pushed them along the sidewalk, the faint scent of rain and earth lingering in the air, adding to the weight of the night. The bus stop sat on a dimly lit stretch of road, bordered by a closed convenience store and an empty parking lot. The store's flickering neon sign had gone out hours ago, leaving behind only a dull reflection in the glass windows. The parking lot was nearly deserted, save for a single car parked near the far end, its silhouette barely visible under the weak glow of the streetlights. Overhead, the light above the bus stop buzzed intermittently, casting long, distorted shadows on the sidewalk. We had just finished grabbing dinner downtown, the warmth of the restaurant now feeling like a distant memory. Neither of us were in a rush. We talked in low voices, casually chatting about work, weekend plans, and other meaningless things to pass the time. The occasional honk of a distant car punctuated our conversation, but otherwise, the night was eerily still. I checked my phone. The bus was scheduled to arrive in 15 minutes. With nothing else to do, Jake and I leaned against the bench, our gazes drifting to our screens as we scrolled through social media, the blue light from our phones making the surrounding darkness feel even deeper. Then, I noticed them. Across the street, standing just beyond the glow of a flickering street lamp, two men loitered near the entrance of the parking lot. At first, I thought they were just waiting for someone, maybe smoking or killing time. But something about the way they stood, too still, too quiet, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. One of them had his hood up, his face partially obscured. The other, a taller man in a worn-out baseball cap, shifted slightly, just enough for me to notice he was glancing in our direction. I nudged Jake. "Hey, check those guys out." He looked up, following my gaze. His expression remained neutral, that though his fingers instinctively tightened around his phone. Probably just waiting for a ride. Maybe. But something in my gut told me otherwise. Minutes passed. The men didn't move. They just stood there watching. My grip on my phone tightened as the familiar feeling of unease settled deep in my stomach. Then, the taller one stepped off the curb. Across the street, two men stood near the entrance of the parking lot. They weren't talking, weren't smoking, just standing there, their silhouettes barely illuminated by the streetlights. One had his hood up, hands deep in his jacket pockets. The other, a taller man in a worn-out baseball cap, seemed to be subtly glancing in our direction every few seconds. I nudged Jake. "Hey, check those guys out." He looked up, following my gaze, then shrugged. Probably just waiting for someone. I wasn't so sure. There was something too still about them, too watchful. Minutes passed, and they hadn't moved. I tried to shake off the creeping unease, but my grip on my phone tightened. Then, the taller one stepped off the curb. He walked toward our side of the street, crossing at a leisurely pace. The hooded man remained where he was, still watching. I felt Jake shift beside me, and I could tell he was starting to feel it too, that gut instinct that something wasn't right. The man reached our side and slowed his pace, walking past the bus stop but staying within earshot. He pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and exhaled a stream of smoke before speaking. "You guys waiting for the bus?" His voice was low, almost too casual. Jake answered before I could. "Yeah." The man nodded, then took another drag. Lot of weird people out at night. He glanced down the road, as if expecting someone. You never know who you'll run into. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. Was he just making conversation, or was there something more behind his words? The man didn't walk away. He just stood there, a few feet from us, taking slow drags of his cigarette. I glanced at the parking lot. The hooded man was still there, watching us like a silent observer. My stomach twisted. This wasn't random. Jake shifted his weight. "Bus should be here soon." The man smirked. "Hope so." Another long pause. The air felt heavier, thick with something unspoken. I checked my phone. The bus was still 5 minutes away. 5 long, agonizing minutes. Then, the hooded man started walking toward us. Every hair on my neck stood on end. My heartbeat thudded against my chest, and my body tensed instinctively. Jake took a slight step closer to me, and I knew he felt it too. This was no coincidence. The man with the cigarette flicked his ashes onto the sidewalk and turned slightly, as if positioning himself. The hooded man's pace was slow but deliberate. I made a decision. I grabbed Jake's arm and muttered, "Let's go." Without waiting for a response, I started walking, not running, just walking, toward the small convenience store a block away. Jake followed instantly, not asking questions. The moment we moved, so did they. They weren't running after us, but they were following. I could hear their footsteps behind us, matching our pace. I reached the convenience store and pushed the door open, stepping into the bright fluorescent light. The clerk, a middle-aged man in a red vest, barely looked up from his magazine. Jake and I moved to the counter, pretending to browse snacks while keeping an eye on the front. Through the glass door, we saw them, standing just outside, watching. The man with the cigarette leaned against the wall, taking another slow drag. The hooded one stood motionless. Then, after what felt like an eternity, they exchanged a glance and walked away. We stayed in the store for another 10 minutes, waiting to make sure they were gone. When the bus finally pulled up outside, we practically sprinted to it, not looking back. Neither of us spoke for most of the ride home. It wasn't until we got off at our stop that Jake finally muttered, "That was messed up." I nodded. They were waiting for us. I don't know what those men wanted that night. Maybe they were just messing with us. Maybe they were planning something worse. But from that night on, I never waited at a bus stop without scanning my surroundings first. Because sometimes, when your gut tells you something is wrong, it is. It was about 6 months ago. I had just finished work and was heading home, my backpack slung over one shoulder, the straps digging slightly into my tired muscles. The streets weren't entirely empty. Cars passed by occasionally, their headlights flashing briefly before disappearing down the road. But there were few pedestrians. The bus stop I was waiting at was one I had used countless times before. It was on a quiet street near a row of closed storefronts, their metal shutters locked tight for the night. A street light flickered above, casting a weak yellowish glow over the pavement. A single bench sat beside the shelter, which had scratches and old posters peeling at the edges. I checked my phone. The bus was still about 10 minutes away. I sighed and adjusted my stance, shifting my weight from one foot to the other. That's when I noticed him. A man stood a few feet away from the bus stop, leaning against the wall of a closed pharmacy. At first, I didn't pay much attention to him. He could have just been another commuter waiting for the bus. But something about him felt off. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't smoking. He wasn't doing anything, really. Just standing there, staring ahead, his posture unnervingly stiff. The collar of his dark jacket was turned up, partially obscuring his face. He wasn't exactly looking at me, but I could tell he was aware of my presence. I tried to ignore him and focused on my phone, scrolling mindlessly through notifications. But every few seconds I glanced up, expecting him to have moved. He never did. My stomach twisted with unease. 5 minutes passed, then 7. The bus was late. I was hyper-aware of every little sound, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the distant hum of traffic, the faint buzz of the streetlight above me. But the thing that unsettled me most was the complete lack of movement from the man. Then suddenly he shifted. It wasn't much, just a small step forward, but it felt deliberate, calculated. My grip tightened around my phone. Another car passed, briefly illuminating him. That's when I saw it. A slight smirk, not a friendly one, not an amused one. A smirk that sent a chill down my spine. I swallowed hard and forced myself to think rationally. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he was just some guy waiting for his ride. But my gut told me otherwise. I looked down the road again. The bus wasn't coming yet. The next stop was about 2 blocks away. If I started walking now, I could catch the bus there instead. Or I could stay. I made my decision. I took a deep breath and started walking. The moment I moved, I heard it. Footsteps, not rushed, not heavy, but unmistakably there. He was following me. I didn't turn around. I kept my pace steady, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. My heart pounded against my ribs as I approached the next intersection. Then, in my peripheral vision, I saw him. He had crossed the street and was keeping pace with me on the other side. That's when I knew. This wasn't just paranoia. This was real. I reached into my pocket and pretended to answer a call, raising my phone to my ear. "Hey, yeah, I'm almost home," I said, loud enough for him to hear. "Yeah, just a couple of minutes away. You're waiting outside, right?" I hoped that, if he was planning something, the idea of someone expecting me would make him rethink. But he didn't stop. If anything, he picked up his pace. I was running out of time. The next bus stop was still a block away, and I could hear his footsteps closing the gap. My heart hammered as I spotted an open convenience store just ahead. Bright lights, a cashier inside. Without hesitation, I veered toward it, pushing the door open so hard that the bell above jingled loudly. The warmth and fluorescent lights were jarring after the cold, dark street. The cashier, a bored-looking man in his 20s, glanced up from behind the counter. I turned around just in time to see the man outside slow his pace. He stopped a few feet away, just beyond the store's entrance, his hands still buried in his jacket pockets. He stared for a moment. Then slowly he turned and walked away. I stayed in the store for another 10 minutes, pretending to browse the shelves, my hands still shaking. When I finally stepped out, I checked every direction before hurrying back to the bus stop. When the bus finally arrived, I stepped on and collapsed into a seat, my body still tense. I never saw the man again. But from that night on, I never waited for a bus without constantly checking my surroundings.